Governments the world over are looking at austerity measures to help battle the financial crisis. But while it might seem like common sense to tighten the purse strings during hard economic times, our next guest says austerity is actually a dangerous idea. Joining us now for more, Mark Blyth. He's professor of international political economy at the Ivy League Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and the author of Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Mark, it's great to have you in the studio.
It's very nice to be back.
We've had you on this program many times, but it's always been on satellite down to the States, so we're really glad to have you here. I want to talk about the notion of balancing our budgets and getting our economy in better shape by implementing austerity budget measures, which many governments the world round are implementing. Why do you think this is such a dangerous idea?
There's three reasons, Steve. The first one is that we can't all do it at once. There's a problem of composition. If everybody tries to save at once, there's no income from which to save. So you have to think about the relationship between spending and saving. While it makes sense to save, while it makes sense to clear your balance sheet of your company or a state or balance your budget in general of your household, if we all try to do it at one time, then all you do is shrink the economy. So a very simple way to think about this. Imagine a simple sum, a fraction, right? And on the top, you've got the numerator, and the bottom, you've got the denominator. So the top is the amount of debt you've got, and the bottom is your GDP, how much of your economy you've got. If everyone cuts and GDP gets smaller, what happens to the size of the debt relatively? It gets bigger. And every country in Europe that's undergone an austerity program now has more debt, much more than when they started. So if the point of the whole thing is to reduce debt, it's literally pointless if everyone tries to do it simultaneously. Number two, the next one is it's not fair. Who are the people who actually rely on government services? They're the people at the bottom end of the income distribution, not the people at the top. And the people at the top are the ones who, frankly, have made out like bandits over the past 30 years of the financialization of the economy. They're the ones, the creditors, who the low inflation regime has benefited. They produce the debt that masks the maldistribution of income right across all those OECD countries. And now, after bailing out the assets of the very people who created the debt, we're now going to say to the people who didn't benefit, you're the ones who need to pay. Well, that produces a very toxic and very dangerous politics. You have a kind of creditor-debtor standoff where those who can pay don't want to, and those who can't pay are being asked to. Look at the Italian elections. That's where this is the first round of this, and it could get potentially much worse. And that's what the lessons of history certainly tell us. Number three, the confidence fairy story is a confidence fairy story. If you really think about it, the whole notion that businesses waiting inside, sitting on piles of capital, waiting to invest, right? That's all true. Why are they doing this? Because they're uncertain about Obamacare. Well, only one country has Obamacare, and you've got lots of countries in recession. So what's really behind this? The actual argument for confidence goes like this. So imagine that the government decides to cut spending, and I'm a consumer, just your average consumer. Well, I look at my lifetime budget, and I say, hey, these guys are going to spend less money in the future. That means I have less taxes in the future. That means I have more money now. So despite the economy falling around my ears, I'm going to go out and spend more money now and cure the recession while it's ongoing. That's nonsense. No one it's a wonderful modelling contrivance if you're an economist, but it's a nonsense in terms of how it actually plays out in the world. So the confidence fairy is a fairy story. It produces toxic politics, and it doesn't work if everyone does it at the same time. Okay, so why are we doing it?
Let's pick these apart a little bit. Well, before we pick it apart, you say, why are we doing it? We're doing it because we've done it for a long time, right? How far back does this idea go?
It goes all the way back to, you can trace it back to John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, the chapter that he talks about basically the invention of property. Here's the kind of liberal, by which I mean sort of the classical meaning of the word, individuals, limited state, etc. The classical liberal reading of what's going on here, right? You can't trust the state. But you need to, because if you let markets do their thing, you end up with, guess what, lots of inequality. Adam Smith has a line in The Wealth of Nations where he talks about, for every one rich man, there are 500 poor, and he's constantly regarded with jealousy. And that's why you need the state, because if you have this unequal distribution, the state has to police the distribution. But any state that's strong enough to police the distribution is strong enough to come and take your property. Hence why you always have this, get the government out of my thing, whatever, right? So you need it, right? You need it, but you kind of don't want it at the same time. Now, here's the problem. You've also got to pay for it. Because any state that's strong enough to protect your assets or keep the rabble away from your door is going to be expensive. And you don't want to pay taxes. So how are you going to do this? Well, this is where government debt comes up. Because government debt's the best wheeze ever. Because the government is going to pay you to fund them. But the problem with that is if everybody buys government debt, you're not going into real investment. And what happens is the debt balloons, the productive capacity of the economy falters, and we end up with a mess, which is why classical liberal economics likes government debt to a point and then really has a toxic fear of it. And we're kind of hardwired for this response over 400 years. So whenever we have like a debt overhang, we reach for the aspirin marked austerity, even if it doesn't actually work.
Let's start to pick apart then some of the three that you have here. Not all at once was number one. Could you argue that we're not actually all doing it at once? India's still spending, China's still spending, Brazil's still spending. There's lots of the world that isn't following the austerity roadmap right now, and therefore those that do can get away with it.
You could do that, but let's think about it this way. They're only able to do well because they're export-driven economies, particularly the China case is the classic example. So if America stops spending, what happens to China's capacity to do exports? Germany's in the same position in the Eurozone. Their source of demand is external to the Eurozone, so they can tell everyone else to get their house in order because the Chinese are buying their BMWs. Well, the Chinese stop buying their BMWs, then you've got a problem. So even though the fallacy of composition seems to be limited to like all the countries in the Eurozone, it actually spills out right around the global economy. And once you have very big economies, such as the Americans beginning to do this through sequestration and other devices, although that's not really austerity, that's more political theatre, if you like, as far as I'm concerned, the results are that the simultaneous contraction gets tighter and tighter. And one way to look at this, if you go back to the 1930s, you had the Americans and the Brits simultaneously contracting. You had the Germans contracting in the 1930s. That's the real reason that you end up with Adolf Hitler. It's not the inflation which ends in 1924. He's elected in 1933, long after the inflation is tamed. And then even in Japan, the Japanese got so fed up of, Japanese military, I should say, got so fed up of budget cuts in the 1930s, they started to assassinate their civilian financial elite and their finance ministers. So austerity can rack up quite a body count when you start to do it too tight all at once.
Okay, but have we gone so far? So there's certainly been lots of demonstrations in the streets, and obviously you being from over there, you've seen lots of those kinds of protests. But have governments fallen over the implementation of too much austerity?
So far, not so much. Italy is the first time we've really seen this. Mario Monti was the technocrat who was put in charge. Everyone was meant to vote for sensible policies. They ended up voting for their version of Stephen Colbert. Good luck with that, right?
Beppe Grillo.
Beppe Grillo, exactly. So it's reaching a point where people are saying, so let me get this straight. What you're asking me to do is to vote for another 5 years where I'm going to be miserable and unemployed. You're asking the Spanish under 25 to vote for 60% of them to be unemployed. And the argument for this is it's all going to be better down the road. Well, there was a famous line an economist once said about that, which is in the long run, we're all dead.
We're all dead. Who said that?
I believe it's a guy called Keynes.
John Maynard Keynes.
That's
okay.
the one, yeah.
Well, if this is as bad as you say it is, and everybody knows how this movie ends, because we've seen it before, why is it still an irresistible prescription for so many governments around the world today?
Well, Canada's an interesting one for me in this regard, because when I was giving a talk here, I looked up all the figures on what's been going on at provincial level, etc. And you guys are kind of doing fake austerity. It's almost like you want to just join in the club with everyone else who's being stupid. So you freeze teacher salaries and you do a little bit of trimming here and there, but it's nothing serious. Where it's serious is in Europe. Now, why is it serious? Why is America growing and Europe is not? One of the answers, a very important component, is what happened to the financial system. Because the Federal Reserve is a real central bank, and here's what I mean by that. Ben Bernanke doesn't need to ask anyone's permission to do a deal with the banks to go in, take out all the toxic assets, dump it on the balance sheet of the Fed, flood them with capital, allow them to de-lever, that is, pay back their debts. And now the financial sector's de-levered. Guess what? I'm getting a really good deal on a mortgage. I'm buying a condo. We're about to start to grow, 3% growth. What's happened in Europe is you have a banking system that's 3 times the size of the American banking system and twice as levered up. And you've got a central bank which can talk a lot, can add liquidity, but it can't go in and do that thing that Bernanke did. So you've got dead assets on zombie banks being kept alive, and they can't restart the growth process. Now, all these countries have these hugely levered banks, but they don't have their own currencies, so they can't devalue. And they don't have their own printing press, so they can't inflate. They can't default, because that's the end of the world. So what are you left with? Deflation, austerity. They're kind of stuck with it. Now, there are various ways that you could get unstuck, but they're not willing to take those steps just now.
Well, let me push back a bit on Canada. And I'm not going to speak about today, but certainly 20 years ago, there were a lot of people in the Ministry of Finance who read the Wall Street Journal and said, this country's going up against the debt wall, and pretty soon you're going to be a third world banana republic. And they got serious about deficit reduction, and they did bring in what by Canadian standards would have been austere measures. We cut back in spending, we cut back transfers from senior to junior levels of government, and they balanced the books and had 9 straight years of surplus. So austerity worked.
You guys are the poster child, but let's go back to Keynes for a moment. When did you do that? Keynes has a nice line for this. The boom, not the slump, is the time for austerity. And what happened in Canada was the loonie lost nearly 40% of its value between 1976 and 1986. Mm-hmm. When did you do your first consolidation plan?
It would have been 94, 95, 96, around
So you
that.
get this huge devaluation that allows, first of all, massive expansion of your economy on the back of the American economy, which is 9 times the size of the Canadian economy. Their currency appreciates, your currency depreciates, you're doing well. You know when you've got a lot of debt and you're doing well, you should pay it back. It's a really good idea. When you're not doing well and everybody else is trying to cut and you try and pay that back, that's a really dangerous idea.
But let's flip the coin over and say, if you believe austerity doesn't work when we're in difficult economic times like these, surely we can't just keep borrowing more and more and more and more, because at some point you got to pay it back. And if interest rates go up even a point, we're looking at massively more money to pay back. Isn't that fair to say?
It's fair to say, but it's also unfair to say, therefore, you can't do anything. Let's remember this one. The argument you often hear is, well, we can't borrow just now because we're burdening our children. Well, if you don't borrow just now, you're not investing in your future. You're leaving them a smaller economy. You're dropping the track of GDP growth. They're going to be poorer, but perhaps a little bit more solvent. So on the balance sheet of costs and benefits, it's not entirely clear to me that this is a better option. In terms of spending now, you don't have to be so ambitious. Just stop doing it. If you look at the Latvian case, everyone's favourite poster child at the moment, they started to rebound and grow in 2010 when they stopped doing austerity. There's a no-harm principle here. First of all, just stop doing it. That might be a good idea. There are certain countries that probably shouldn't be in the euro. Figure out how to get them out and then restore the order. And in terms of the Americans, until the renminbi becomes a credible reserve asset and the euro becomes a credible reserve asset, which isn't happening anytime soon, precisely because of these dynamics, the Americans can borrow at real interest rates that are negative, and 1 in 3 bridges in the United States are unsafe by the American Institute of Engineers. That would be a no-cost productivity enhancement. Why not do that? There's stupid spending and there's smart spending.
Well, that's the problem. You take there's too much stupid spending, don't
There's
you agree?
not so much as too much stupid spending. I mean, let's remember the United States government now has designed a fiscal order that doesn't work. Right? They can't get anything out of Congress. The only functional part of the government is the central bank, and that's extremely controversial in terms of what it's doing. So it's not a question just of the ability to spend or the ability to target things. Remember in the stimulus, you used to talk about what's shovel-ready and what's not. There's many innovations that need to be backed. There's many potential things that could be invested in, and we're simply not doing it. Those of a more, let's say, Schumpeterian flavour will say that
more which?
From Joseph Schumpeter, the economist.
Oh, Schumpeter, yes.
Schumpeter,
okay.
sorry, Schumpeter. Basically, the whole idea of creative destruction, right? You're meant to let the economy bottom out, get rid of the bad investments, the innovators come along and do stuff. There's a guy called Bill Janeway, who's a very successful venture capitalist, and he argued in a book that he did recently called Doing Capitalism and the Innovation Economy, that what makes innovation possible for people like him is what he calls Keynesian waste. So think about it this way. If you didn't have defense spending, you wouldn't have Boeing. If you didn't have National Institutes of Health spending on basically research for the sake of research, you don't have biotech. The internet comes out of DARPA in the Defense Department. People forget this. So if you madly cut away all this wasteful government spending in the name of austerity, you are cutting away, pardon my language, the dung heap that the dung beetle of entrepreneurship crawls all over to find the good bits. So there's a lot of reasons to be careful here in terms of just saying, we don't want to spend. Remember, my spending is someone else's income.
So the alternative then to austerity is what?
The alternative to austerity is, first of all, just stop doing it. It's much, much better if you stop doing it. The second alternative is to invest smartly in your future and recognize that not all debt is bad debt. Because we're reaching a point now with climate change and other sort of, let's say, pressing future needs that we need to think smartly. Now, this doesn't mean that we just then continue to print money and we continue to issue debt. We need reform on many, many social programs right across the world. Demography matters. We're not having enough kids to pay the future taxes. We've got people who are, pardon me saying this, living too long in terms of the expectations of the welfare states that were built to support them. These things need to be calibrated, but they don't need to be calibrated right now.
So do you agree with sort of raising the retirement age to 67 or preventing old age security from paying out until then?
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
okay.
That's totally fine. Okay. And the other side of it, on the Defense Department side, the United States is spending more on defense now than it did at the height of the Cold War. And it's fighting against guys with AK-47s. Somebody tell me how we need an F-35 fighter. What are we going to do? Fighting space aliens?
Well, I think everybody's reevaluating that one at the moment.
But not just that one. You want to talk about government waste? There's a lot of government waste on a lot of programs, but they tend to be the ones that are very, very protected. So we need to lose that, but we lose that when we're growing again. The best cure for debt is growth.
But there's, okay, let me put these numbers to you for a second and you tell me, because Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Front Porch Canada hears that from 1867, when we became a country, to 2008, we incurred X number of debt. I think in the province of Ontario, where we are right now, it was something like $125 billion. In the last 5 years, we've doubled that. That sounds scary. It sounds like the response to that should be hit the brakes, stop spending. No?
And if you were the only country doing it and everyone else was growing, it would be fine. But you're not. That's the problem. It's the simultaneity, the contraction, everybody doing it at once. It makes perfect sense for any one household, any one firm, any one country to try and clean its balance sheet. But if everybody does it at once, that's the problem. And that's where we are just now. So I don't really have a problem with any of this. I personally don't carry much debt. Why? Because I don't want to pay someone interest pointlessly. But at the same time, there's such a thing as investment through debt. Buy a mortgage. What are you doing? You're investing in your family's future by giving them a house that you hope will appreciate in value. Not all debt is bad.
No, but do we have any hope of paying off the debts we've incurred?
Yes, absolutely. Let's think about it this way. The Americans, I believe, haven't actually paid back the debt from the Civil War yet. And people go, oh my God, that's terrible. Yes, but the American economy during the Civil War was about this size. It is now this size. So the relative amount of debt is much smaller.
But they're 15, 16 trillion in debt right now?
Yeah, it's 100% of GDP, absolutely. At the end of World War II, it was much higher. Let's remember this one. There's another way to think about this. What else do you do? People need to pay for what they want. So it's called taxation. The United States pays federal state pays out about 25% of GDP in taxes. The OECD average is about 38%, so they're way down in terms of what they spend. They only tax at 17, 18%. Now, that's your deficit. Multiply that over years, that's your debt. You don't even need to invoke a financial crisis to be there.
But don't those low tax rates help them be the dynamic economy that they are?
No, that's absolutely mythical. Growth rates and taxes are extremely uncorrelated. Ask the Swedes. They have some of the highest taxes in the world, and their growth rate basically always trends up towards the top end. It's never the very top, but it's up there. There are tax efficiency costs. But massive tax capacity is there. And if you want to pay back debt, a really good way of doing it is raising revenue. The notion that chipping away at the notional value of the debt, particularly in an income distribution where the people who are being asked to pay don't have any income, is just futile. It simply doesn't work. Here's one that I like to throw at the supply side tax guys. I'll ask you this one. What was the top rate of marginal tax rate under Eisenhower?
90.
91.
91.
It was 87 with tax relief, and America had never been stronger. It's been cutting its taxes ever since. It's gotten smaller, weaker, angrier.
That's an interesting place to leave it. Mark Blyth, it's awfully good of you to join us here at TVO today. Thanks very much.
Always a pleasure, Steve. Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.